Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to another series of conversations with global experts on the US-China relationship, perhaps the most consequential issue of our time. The series is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'm really honored to have as my guest today, Mr. Arthur Kroeber. Arthur is a partner and head of research at GaveKal, a Hong Kong-based economic research firm. He's founder of its China-focused Dragonomics research service. Before establishing Dragonomics in 2002, Arthur spent 15 years as a financial and economic journalist in China and South Asia. He is adjunct professor of economics at New York University Stern School of Business, a senior non-resident fellow of the Brookings Tsinghua Center in Beijing, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the National Committee on US-China Relations. He's author of the well-received book, China's Economy, What Everyone Needs to Know, by the Oxford University Press. So please welcome Mr. Arthur Kroeber. Arthur, how are you?
I'm very well, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you very much for the time. I understand you're in New York. Are you missing China?
Yes, I was actually back in China for a couple of months from mid-November to mid-January, and life was very normal there because they were successful at controlling the coronavirus, but I had other obligations that brought me back to New York. I'm looking forward to when it'll be easier to go back and forth more swiftly than is the case now.
Listen, I wanted to start off by asking you about one of your famous or infamous quotes, which is that Washington's strategic freakout is largely a response to Xi Jinping's successful leadership. Boy, that sends up balloons in Washington. Talk about that, if you will.
Well, yeah, that's I guess a statement that's a little bit. It was intended to be somewhat provocative, and I think the ideas that I was trying to get at when I said that, the underlying ideas are, number one, Xi Jinping is a very different leader than we've seen in China for a long time.
Right.
And what he has succeeded in doing is crystallizing and making even more successful China's authoritarian political model. And if you go back to the prior generations of leadership, they steered China's economy very successfully. But the society was not very well disciplined. It was a little bit chaotic, in many, largely in good ways. This provided for a lot of entrepreneurial dynamism in the economy and so forth, but it was not strongly coordinated at the top. And what Xi has done is that he's established a much more strong, effective, centralized leadership. And this, I think, is a challenge for the United States because it now has to take China much more seriously as an economic, technological, and political rival, whereas a somewhat less organized China previously was less of a challenge, right? I think the reason I used freakout also is because I think that there has been, although a lot of the concerns in Washington are quite legitimate, there's been a lot of exaggeration, hyperbole, and frankly, overreaction in terms of claiming that China is already a technological leader, already a massive force projection threat, these kinds of things. It is possible over the next 10 to 20 years that China will become much more formidable technologically and militarily than it is now. But I think there is a tendency right now to, number one, overstate China's capacities, which are considerable, but have a lot of shortcomings. And also overstate the negativity of everything that China does. There are clearly a lot of dimensions in which China is a challenge to US interests. There are clearly other dimensions in which it is not, and sometimes I think that gets lost.
Do you think that we also, or some of these analysts also exaggerate the negativity in the United States, in the sense that, well, America is now going to be relegated to second place. It's in a downward trajectory. Do you think that's true, or do you think we exaggerate that in the analysis as much as we do China's strengths?
Right. I mean, we can make it true if we choose to do that. And this is sort of my other sort of general critique of the way China is sometimes presented, which is that I think a lot of the things that are talked about as problems of China, so China's technological development or whatever, really are reflective of internal problems within the United States, where we have missed a trick or two. We have not done as much as we could in investing in our own capabilities, in our own workforce, in rectifying the problems in our own society. And then when these problems pop up, we tend to blame them on China's unfair practices or whatever. So I think a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about China is actually relates to problems within the US system that we need to fix. So yeah, if we don't fix those problems, then we can degrade into a second-rate power, but we certainly have the capacity to fix them.
But tell me this, Arthur, back to this Xi Jinping and his successful leadership, which I totally agree with you on. But having accumulated so much power, I mean, history shows that this kind of a cult of personality comes usually with a downfall. Do you think that Xi Jinping has mastered that balance from what we know and what we see, that he's using this for the good of China to raise it, become a great power, but that he's not going to let that get away from him? What is your thought? Broad question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the honest answer is that we could give one answer today, and then the answer might change in the future. But from where it stands now, I think, first of all, to call Xi Jinping running a cult of personality, thereby equating him in some way with Mao Zedong in the 50s and 60s, that's a gross exaggeration. There's nothing close to that. There's also nothing close to the level of complete totalitarian control over every aspect of people's lives, which was a reality of China in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And when I first went to China in 1985, there were vestiges of that still visible. There's nothing like that today. This is a much more open, complicated, dynamic society, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle.
So if I may just interrupt briefly, are you saying that this pyramid of hundreds of thousands of members of the Communist Party, as it narrows to the Politburo and then to Xi Jinping, that indeed does work in transmitting opinion downwards, and that he has to be to some extent responsive?
Right. So I think the point about Xi is, and yeah, first of all, it's not hundreds of thousands. It's actually, I think, over 90 million Communist Party members.
Okay.
A lot of them. But a lot of them are, some of them work for me and aren't, frankly, very interested in the Communist Party. Some of them are ordinary civil servants. But I think that the larger point here is that Xi Jinping is the inheritor of a line of thought within the Communist Party, which is not exactly a Maoist line of thought. It is a line that says, look, we are the stewards of the nation. We are an elite that has a responsibility to steer China into a greater future. So that means that we have to invest in infrastructure, in education, in environmental protection, all kinds of things that make people's lives better, not just by raising their incomes, but by increasing the quality of their lives.
Right.
And we have to invest in things that increase national power. So high technology, the military, and so forth. They are both, these are both parts of it. And you have to be a good steward. There's a strong sense of what it means to be a successful government in China, and Xi is a representative of that. So it's not all about himself as a personal dictator creating a cult of personality. It's him leading the party, and then the party leading the country to a better place. And I think that's deeply felt. The risk is, obviously, he's now essentially said that he can be president for as long as he wants, which could be another 10, 15, 20 years. And history tells us that when you have these long-running individual dictatorships, the quality of governance does tend to degrade over time. So at the moment it's successful, it may not be so successful 10 or 15 years from now.
Okay. And along the same lines then, do you think that they have this, a lot of analysts here in America especially, and to some extent the European Union, point out that there are some built-in instability factors in China. For example, the demographic side of it, the income inequality. I was reading in the Financial Times today that even next to the big new Apple factory, it's hard to sell houses. They're giving discounts, whereas on the coast, nothing sells unless it's above the price. Do you think that these are very serious issues that have risen to the top of the control pyramid? Do you think, how serious are these?
They're serious. I would put them all in the category of things that are serious, but problems that the state in China does have the capacity to manage. It's not a guarantee that they will succeed, but they have the capacity. So just looking at it quickly, if you look at the demographic shift, the worker to retiree ratio in China today is approximately the same as Japan in 1980. There's about 5 people of working age for every person of retirement age. 20 years from now, that ratio will look like Japan today. So China is rapidly moving to a very old society with a lot less workers, a lot more retirees. And what we know is that that tends to come with much lower growth and much less dynamism.
Right.
They can deal with this by extending retirement ages. People tend to retire quite early, by increasing the use of robots in factories and automation throughout society and so forth. So that is a very severe problem, and I think it will get particularly severe towards the end of this decade. So they have some ability to manage that, but fundamentally, China by the middle of this century is going to be much older and much more demographically difficult society than the United States. So that's one of the reasons that I'm relatively optimistic when we look at the relative position of the U.S. and Europe, U.S. and China. 20 or 30 years from now, the United States demographically will be much better off. When we look at income inequality, this has been an issue of Chinese policymaking really for the last 20 years. The growth that they've had has lifted all boats to some extent, but it's definitely lifted a lot of boats higher than many others. There's a lot of inequality, and they keep trying to grapple with it somewhat successfully. My general observation would be that most people in China do not seem as resentful about inequality as you might think, basically because for most people, China is still a place of opportunity where if you work hard, you can in fact get ahead, and you can reasonably expect that your children will have a better life than you will. So as long as they can keep that sort of level of positive economic expectations up, they can probably manage the inequality.
I find that particular message from you quite important in context with the issues we've seen in American body politic in the last few months, Arthur. In this way, about a few months ago, the New York Times ran this article, which was titled, "The American Dream is Alive and Well in China." And what it pointed out with a curve was what's happened to the lower 50% of the American population versus the population in China. And the American lower 50% was flat to going down, middle class getting really not decimated, but really hurt, whereas the Chinese curve just kept going up, right? And so my question to you is, because you've said something that I haven't heard before, which is that the people are not that concerned because they have opportunity. Do you think this points directly to the major issue today in American politics, which is we need to create that sense of opportunity again in America?
Right. Well, so I broadly, I agree with that. I would just throw in a small caveat, which is that it is still the case that particularly among the educated middle and upper middle classes in China, there are lots of people who want to send their kids abroad for education. It used to be graduate school. Now it's universities and even high schools. A lot of people are not happy with the level of ideological control that exists in China. So yeah, in a purely material economic sense, upward mobility, I think, has been an important feature of Chinese society and continues to be, and we've lost a little bit of that in the United States. But it's also the case that China is a very controlled society, and there are a lot of creative people who want to get out for various reasons. So I think it's a little bit too strong to say that China has sort of taken over the American dream. They've taken over the money part of it, but the sort of the creativity part of it, they keep. The Communist Party's control agenda keeps getting in the way of that. And that, again, is a major advantage, I think, that the United States has, despite all of its problems.
Right.
We're still seen as this beacon of liberty and creativity, and China is just not going to get there. But I think your other point is correct, that a lot of what needs to happen with the U.S., even if you want to frame it in terms of how do we compete with China, a lot of that just has to do with getting our own house in order and making sure that people in the United States do feel that they have opportunity for dignified work, and they're not sort of scrambling around the edges, a foot or two away from a precipice of bankruptcy because of medical bills or job insecurity or whatever. And we clearly have not done a good job of that over the past 2 decades, and we need to do some rebuilding of our domestic social structure.
I'm inching into this whole question of the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the guests that I had on this program, Arthur, who's actually been an ambassador to China and to his own country, pointed out that the Belt and Road Initiative, which grew with 6 or 7 countries, now it's up to 139, he said has for the first time given China a grand strategy. And he thinks that that's very important to realize, that even though there are issues with it and so on, but this is a major thrust to make China very, very influential. What are your views on the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, well, first of all, my observation would be the Belt and Road is probably the most successful advertising slogan in Chinese history, because that's basically what it is. It is a phrase that Xi Jinping or people around him came up with back in 2013 to describe a phenomenon that was already going on, which was the Chinese engineering companies were going around the world building infrastructure for people. That had been going on for years. No one called it the Belt and Road. Then they put a label on it, and not that much changed on the ground. Chinese companies continued to do their thing. Because they're very good at that. There was more state support for it, more explicit financing support for it. But I think the other point is that it crystallized the notion that China does want to play an international role, right? And it was no longer an inward-looking country. It was a country looking to play a global role, in Bob Zellick's terms, become a responsible stakeholder in the world. But they wanted to do it on Chinese terms, not terms that were set by the United States. So this is how we're going to do it, right? And I think it does represent. I want to not get too tied up in the slogan or the advertising brand of Belt and Road, but if we just step back and say China is actively trying to increase its economic influence throughout the world, and then translate that economic influence into political influence. Absolutely. And they're doing, I think, something that is in some ways analogous to what the United States did after World War II. After World War II, essentially the U.S. had a couple of strategic objectives. One was to not have World War III. And then the other was to contain the Soviet Union and expand U.S. influence against the Soviet bloc. So we needed to figure out a way to do that in a way that wouldn't trigger a nuclear war, right? And the way we did it, part of the way we did it was to create this global economic system with institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the GATT, then later the WTO, et cetera, free trade treaties and all these kinds of things. So an architecture of economic development as a way of extending political influence. That was very successful for the US. And I think what China's up to is something analogous, is to create an architecture of economic development that will also contribute to China's growing geopolitical influence. And it is very serious.
So, Arthur, I have a question from one of our viewers who says that the BRI is a long-term plan. The US simply can't do long-term planning because it's democracy and they want a fast return on what they're investing in. Any truth to that?
No. So I'll just go back to what I said a minute ago. The US actually had a very analogous strategy after World War II to build this economic framework. That was a project that took decades, literally, to do. It wasn't a specific plan. No one sat down in 1947 and said, here are the 17 elements of the economic order that we're going to build.
Correct.
Combat the Soviet Union. It was sort of piece by piece, but it was a sustained effort over a long period of time. And I think it's quite obvious that the US, particularly if you think of the US as not acting alone, but acting in concert with the other advanced democracies, of course it's possible to do sustained collective effort for common interest. We've done it before. We can keep doing it, and we can do it again. Conversely, the BRI is, as I said, it's an advertising slogan. It is not a thing. There is no sort of blueprint of BRI sitting in Beijing where they're ticking off the boxes of this project and the other project. It's sort of like it's a label that has been placed on a broad influence building effort that has had some real problems, right? So first of all, a lot of the projects have gone bad. They have not delivered a financial return. The Chinese government and its financing agencies are now pulling back on investments. They're capping the amount of lending that they're going to put into these kinds of projects. So there are already financial constraints built in. And we've seen a lot of blowback in many countries where there's been corruption involved or not enough spillovers to the local economy in terms of local workers hired and those kinds of things. So it's not like China has some master plan and they're executing to perfection. They have a vague aspiration that they are executing in some ways well and in some ways poorly. And it is perfectly possible for the advanced world, the Western world under the United States, to mount a sustained response built around our visions of what a global economic order should look like.
So, Arthur, you're recognized quite a bit as an advisor to funds. You run money, and I wonder what you think of the idea that empires, world-leading countries come in waves. And I'm talking now specifically about the hedge fund man, Ray Dalio, who makes a point of studying history, right? And he says, look, we have gone back 15th century, there were the Dutch, they were the masters of the universe. The guilder was the currency. Everyone invested in Amsterdam. And then along came the Brits, along came the Americans. So it is now the turn of the Chinese. They have the population, they have the creativity, they have the drive. So do you think that this is a natural progression and we ought not to be overly paranoid? I mean, America isn't going anywhere, but there's China. How do you factor all that?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to clarify, in our company, I'm a pure research guy. Other people we have a different division that runs money, and I'm not a money manager. I'm a pure research person, so I disclaim any responsible for the return on my colleagues' funds. The second observation I would make is, a little history can be a dangerous thing, particularly in the hands of financial professionals with big egos. Look, I mean, history is a very complex, fluid thing. It is not a deterministic, law of physics. There are patterns that repeat, but there are also new things that come up. And even if you accept the sort of the general observation that societies tend to grow and then they stagnate and then they collapse over some period of time, that has tended to be the case. We don't know whether that continues to be the case in the modern technological universe. But even if it is, you have no idea what the time scale is, right? So if I had walked around the streets of Rome in AD 50 saying Roman Empire is bound to fall, I would have been right eventually. But for a couple of hundred years, I would have been pretty seriously wrong, right? And so I think a lot of the doomsaying that we see about the United States or the triumphalism about China is of a similar nature. Yeah, it's natural. China's an enormous country. It has a lot of comparative advantages. It's been very well run macroeconomically and in other ways, very well governed, even if in a very authoritarian way for a long time. So they're quite successful. So they're rising. That's natural. Does this mean that there's some kind of inevitability to U.S. decline? I don't think so. One index of this would be population, right? So the U.S. population, unless we do something really weird, is going to keep growing throughout this century.
Right.
China's population is going to peak in a few years, and it's going to start shrinking. And we don't have too many examples of countries that sort of became successors to global leadership with a shrinking population. Now, again, maybe technology changes that, but maybe it doesn't, right?
Right.
So I'm not really very interested in those kinds of deterministic grand theories. What I'm more interested in is, understanding correctly why China is successful, the ways in which it's successful, and the ways in which it's limited. And I think the authoritarian system is a double-edged sword. It's been wielded very successfully in terms of material development. It's a real problem in terms of cultural development and soft power influence. U.S. system is in many ways more chaotic and shambolic, but it's much more creative. And I think there's a lot of dynamism that remains to be tapped within the U.S. system. So I'm actually, when I look out 30 years, I'm quite optimistic about the U.S. prospects. And I'm pretty ambivalent, frankly, about where China is going to be at the middle of the century. They could be quite successful, or they could run into some pretty serious problems.
So, Arthur, as we head to the closing segment here, we have just a few minutes left. Would you think about a couple of things if you were sitting in the Oval Office with President Biden and his national security team? I'd like for you to throw out a couple of things that you would tell them that you need to do now to try and get rid of this daggers drawn posture of China. What are the couple of things, projects we can work together on, whatever? What would you say? A couple of things.
Okay, so there's a premise in that question that I'm not sure I entirely accept, which is that it's necessary for the U.S. to have a less adversarial posture towards China.
Okay.
I think you definitely want to reduce the needless confrontation, right? And the last administration had a lot of that, in my opinion. So I guess my major suggestion would be to focus on the stuff that really matters, which means that the United States has to define what its interests really are, and be very careful about understanding when what China is up to actually conflicts with the true interests of ours, right? And I think that's a much shorter list than has typically been the case. It is not against the U.S. interest for China to be economically successful. And frankly, that's a lot of what you hear in Washington today is anything that China does that is successful in any dimension is a threat to the United States. And I think it is really crucial to disavow that rhetoric and get away from it, because in China, there is now a very widespread perception among, a broad segment of the population that is actively supported by government propaganda every day, which is that the United States mission is to keep China down. And that should not be our mission. That is not in the American interest, in my opinion. And if you convey the idea that that is what we're up to, then you create a massive block of people in China who will view the U.S. needlessly as an enemy and as sort of a neo-colonialist power set on trying to crush China and keep it down. So pick your targets wisely. Be clear that there's a specific harm in the United States that you're trying to address, a specific interest that's being impinged on. And, fight those fiercely, right? We should protect our own interests without reserve, and we have to be confrontational, then so be it. But limit the number of targets, and don't get into this trap of saying that any aspect of China's rise is by definition a threat to the United States, because it's just not true.
Well, listen, I could go on forever, and I'm sure our audience would like to listen forever, but we're at that magic moment when I have to say thank you so much, Arthur, for joining us on Polaris-Live today. I hope you will come back and visit this forum again. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. It was a very stimulating conversation.
And I should tell our viewers that this is the end of today's episode. I hope you can come back again next Tuesday for another episode of Polaris-Live. In the meantime, we have a full lineup for April. If you go to my website, www.kashmeri.com, you can read it there. But until next Tuesday, goodbye.